Nancy Mace's fingers trembled above her phone screen. The tweet was written, 23 words that would ignite Washington. Her thumb hovered over the send button. 3 seconds of hesitation. Then she pressed it. Within 30 seconds, 10,000 likes. 2 minutes later, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez responded. And that response would change everything. What Mace didn't know was that AOC had been waiting for exactly this moment. She had receipts, and in 20 minutes, Mace's entire political strategy would collapse in real time. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss how this political war unfolds. Now let's get into what really happened that night in Washington. The glow from Nancy Mace's phone illuminated her face in the dim light of her Capitol Hill office. Outside her window, the Washington Monument stood silent against the darkening November sky. Inside, Mace was about to detonate a bomb that would dominate every news cycle, every social media platform, and every political conversation in America for weeks to come. Her chief of staff had advised against it. Her communications director had warned her 3 separate times throughout the day. Even her closest Republican allies in the House Freedom Caucus had suggested she wait, reconsider, perhaps soften the language or at least coordinate the messaging with leadership first. But Nancy Mace had made up her mind. This wasn't just about bathrooms. This was about drawing a line in the sand. This was about defining her brand as a Republican who wouldn't bend to what she called progressive ideology. This was about securing her position for the next primary, where she knew challengers would come from her right. She read the tweet one final time. The words felt right. Strong. Unambiguous. Exactly the kind of statement her base wanted to see. Her thumb descended onto the blue button. The tweet went live at 6:47 p.m. Eastern Time. The text was simple and direct. Biological men have no place in women's private spaces. Not in our bathrooms, not in our locker rooms, not in our safe spaces. I will be introducing legislation to protect women and girls in the Capitol. This is non-negotiable. The engagement began immediately. Within 30 seconds, the tweet had accumulated 10,000 likes. Within 2 minutes, 50,000. The retweets started flooding in from conservative accounts across the country. Right-wing influencers amplified it instantly. Liberal accounts erupted in outrage. The Twitter algorithm detecting the massive engagement spike pushed the tweet to hundreds of thousands more feeds. Fox News contributors began screenshotting it for their evening segments. Progressive activists started organizing response threads. Nancy Mace set her phone down on her desk and exhaled slowly. She knew what was coming. She'd prepared for it. The backlash from the left. The think pieces in progressive publications calling her a bigot. The cable news segments on MSNBC condemning her. The hashtags demanding her resignation. She'd weathered similar storms before. Her polling numbers among Republican primary voters always went up when Democrats attacked her. But she hadn't prepared for what happened exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds after she hit send. Her phone buzzed with a notification that made her stomach drop. Twitter. A reply. From @AOC. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had responded. Mace's hand moved slowly toward her phone. She picked it up and read the words that were already spreading across the platform faster than her original tweet. The reply was devastating in its precision. This is who Nancy Mace really is. Someone who campaigns as a moderate then bullies the most vulnerable among us for political points. Trans people exist. They deserve dignity. And using your sexual assault survival story to justify discrimination is beneath contempt. The room seemed to tilt. That last sentence landed like a physical blow. Mace had been public about surviving sexual assault. She'd written extensively about it, spoken about it in interviews, used it to connect with voters who'd experienced similar trauma. It was part of her political identity. Part of what made her relatable, part of what distinguished her from other Republican women in Congress. And now Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had weaponized it, turned it against her, accused her of exploiting her own pain to justify what AOC characterized as discrimination against transgender people. The replies under AOC's tweet began multiplying at an exponential rate. Thousands of comments flooded in within the first minute alone. Many attacked Mace personally, questioning her motives, her character, her sincerity. Some went further, questioning whether her assault had even happened, suggesting it was a political fabrication. Others called her a traitor to survivors everywhere, claiming she was using her trauma as a shield for bigotry. Mace's hands were shaking now, not from fear, from rage. She opened the reply box and began typing a response. Her fingers moved quickly, emotions overriding strategy, but halfway through she stopped, deleted everything. Started again. Deleted again. The words weren't coming out right. Everything sounded defensive. Everything sounded weak. Her communications director burst through the office door without knocking, phone in hand, eyes wide with barely controlled panic. The cable news alerts were already broadcasting breaking news banners. CNN had interrupted regular programming. MSNBC was assembling a panel. Fox News was preparing their own coverage. This was no longer a Twitter spat between two congresswomen. This was a national news event unfolding in real time. Mace waved her away without speaking and kept staring at her phone screen. She needed to respond. She needed to hit back. But how? AOC had gone personal. She'd made this about Mace's trauma, about her credibility as a survivor. Any response that seemed too aggressive would make Mace look callous. Any response that seemed too defensive would make her look weak. Before she could decide on a strategy, her phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name that made her jaw tighten. Marjorie Taylor Greene. Mace hesitated, then answered. She held the phone to her ear but said nothing, waiting. Greene's voice came through immediately, electric with excitement and aggression. She'd seen the entire exchange. She wanted to coordinate a unified Republican response. She was already drafting her own tweet supporting Mace. She wanted to introduce companion legislation. She was organizing a press conference for the next morning and wanted Mace to stand beside her when she addressed the media. Mace listened, her jaw tightening with every sentence. This wasn't what she wanted. Greene was unpredictable, often too extreme even for Republican leadership. Her association with conspiracy theories and inflammatory rhetoric made her toxic to moderate voters. Aligning too closely with her could backfire spectacularly, especially in a district like Mace's that had split-ticket voters. But refusing her support could alienate the Republican base that Mace desperately needed for her next primary. She ended the call without committing to anything specific, offering only vague assurances that they would stay in touch. Her phone immediately lit up again. This time it was a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief and ominous. You just made the biggest mistake of your career. Check your mentions in 10 minutes. Mace stared at the text. Anonymous. Threatening. Cryptic. She opened Twitter and began scrolling through her notifications. The flood was overwhelming. Thousands of replies per minute. Tens of thousands of quote tweets. But then she saw something that made her blood run cold. A thread was gaining traction faster than anything else on her timeline. Posted by a progressive activist account with 2.3 million followers. The account had a reputation for opposition research, for digging up old posts and statements from conservative politicians and weaponizing them at strategic moments. The thread contained screenshots. Old screenshots from Nancy Mace's social media accounts. Posts from years ago during her first congressional campaign in 2020. Posts where she'd expressed explicit support for LGBTQ rights. Posts where she'd condemned discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Posts where she'd positioned herself as a new kind of Republican, moderate and inclusive, someone who believed in equality and dignity for all people regardless of their identity. The thread's caption was simple and devastating: Nancy Mace in 2020 versus Nancy Mace in 2024. This is what happens when someone sells their soul for political power. The juxtaposition was brutal. The screenshots were authentic. The contradiction was undeniable. And within minutes, the thread was being amplified by progressive influencers, journalists, political commentators, and activists across every major platform. Then Mace saw the notification that made her realize how bad this had become. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had retweeted the thread. Her addition was a single word: receipts. The retweet was already approaching 300,000 likes. The original thread was nearing 1 million views. And somewhere in New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was probably sitting in her office, watching the same numbers climb, knowing she had just landed a devastating blow. Nancy Mace felt the walls closing in. This wasn't just a Twitter fight anymore. This wasn't just cable news coverage that would fade in a day or two. This was becoming a defining moment. A test of whether she could weather the storm or whether it would consume her completely, destroying her carefully crafted political brand in the process. Her communications director was back in the doorway, this time accompanied by the press secretary and 2 senior advisors. They were all talking simultaneously, offering conflicting advice, presenting different strategies, each more panicked than the last. Someone suggested an immediate press conference. Someone else recommended waiting 24 hours. A third voice argued for a video statement posted directly to social media. But Mace wasn't listening to any of them. Her eyes remained fixed on her phone screen, watching the engagement numbers climb in real time. Aoc'S retweet was now at 450,000 likes. The thread exposing her old posts was approaching 1.5 million views. The story was being picked up by mainstream news outlets. Political analysts were already writing hot takes. Opposition research teams from Democratic campaigns were probably combing through every public statement she'd ever made, looking for more contradictions. And somewhere in the Capitol complex, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was winning. Nancy Mace had started a war. But in the span of 23 minutes, she'd begun to realize that she might have severely underestimated her opponent. Aoc's hadn't just responded to the tweet, she'd been prepared for it, she'd been waiting for it, and now she was executing a strategy that Mace hadn't even considered. The question wasn't whether Nancy Mace could win this fight. The question was whether she could survive it at all. Nancy Mace walked into the press conference room at 9:47 a.m., 11 minutes before the scheduled start time. She'd barely slept. Her team had prepared talking points, practiced responses, war-gamed every possible question. But when she saw who was sitting in the front row, her carefully constructed confidence evaporated. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat with a leather notebook open, pen in hand, staring directly at her with an expression that communicated one thing: I know something you don't. And in exactly 8 minutes, when the cameras started rolling, Mace would discover that Aoc had obtained something that could end her career before lunch. Nancy Mace had spent the previous night in her office, refusing to go home. Sleep felt impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the numbers climbing on her phone screen. The retweets. The quote tweets. The trending hashtags. By midnight, the original exchange had been covered by every major news outlet in America. By 3 a.m., international media had picked it up. By dawn, her name was being discussed in 7 different languages across 4 continents. Her communications team had worked through the night, assembling a crisis response strategy. They'd drafted 3 different versions of a press statement. They'd prepared answers to anticipated questions. They'd scheduled a press conference for 10 a.m., calculating that getting ahead of the news cycle was the only way to regain control of the narrative. The plan was simple: Project Strength, refuse to apologize, reframe the debate around women's safety rather than transgender rights, and paint Aoc as a radical who was out of touch with mainstream American values. The plan had seemed solid at 4 a.m. By 9:45 a.m., walking into the press briefing room, Mace was beginning to doubt everything. The room was packed beyond capacity. Journalists from networks she'd never heard of were crammed into corners. Camera crews lined the back wall. The energy in the space was predatory. These weren't reporters looking for information. These were sharks who'd smelled blood in the water and were circling for the kill. Mace made her way to the podium, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Her press secretary had arrived early to manage the setup, ensuring the lighting was right, the microphones were tested, the backdrop displayed the correct messaging. Everything had been controlled and calibrated for maximum impact. But there was one variable they hadn't controlled. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was sitting in the front row. Mace froze for a fraction of a second when she spotted her. Aoc wasn't supposed to be here. Members of Congress didn't typically attend each other's press conferences, especially not members from opposing parties. especially not members who'd been engaged in a very public Twitter war less than 15 hours earlier. But there she was, seated front and center. Leather notebook open, gold pen poised above blank paper. Hair pulled back, expression neutral. Eyes locked on Mace with an intensity that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. Mace's press secretary leaned in and whispered urgently. Should they delay? Should they ask AOC to leave? Should they relocate to a different room? Mace shook her head. Delaying would look weak. Asking AOC to leave would create an even bigger spectacle. They were committed now. The cameras were live. The feeds were streaming. Millions of people were watching in real time. She stepped up to the podium and arranged her notes, buying herself a few seconds to recalibrate. Her opening statement had been carefully written to sound both compassionate and firm. She would express respect for all people while standing firm on the principle of protecting women's spaces. She would acknowledge the humanity of transgender individuals while refusing to compromise on what she characterized as common-sense safety measures. She began reading from her prepared text, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The words came out exactly as rehearsed. Firm but not angry. Principled but not judgmental. She avoided looking at AOC, keeping her eyes moving across the broader room, making eye contact with various reporters, projecting confidence and control. 3 minutes into her statement, she made the mistake of glancing down at the front row. AOC was writing something in her notebook. Not taking notes, writing something else, something that required concentration. Her pen moved quickly across the page, line after line, covering the paper with text that Mace couldn't read from her position at the podium. Mace felt her rhythm falter. She stumbled over a word, caught herself, continued. But her focus was broken. What was AOC writing? Why was she here? What was she planning? Mace finished her opening statement and transitioned to taking questions. Her press secretary pointed to a reporter from a friendly conservative outlet, someone they'd pre-selected to ask the first question, something they could answer easily to build momentum. But before that reporter could speak, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez raised her hand. The room shifted. Every camera pivoted toward her. Every journalist leaned forward. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for. Mace's press secretary moved to redirect to the pre-selected reporter, but AOC was already speaking, her voice carrying clearly across the room despite not having a microphone. She wasn't asking a question. She was making a statement. She referenced a closed-door Republican conference meeting that had taken place 6 weeks earlier. A meeting where, according to AOC, Nancy Mace had made comments about transgender issues that were far more extreme than her public statements. Comments that had been overheard by staff members. Comments that revealed her true views, views that contradicted the moderate image she tried to project. The room erupted. Reporters began shouting questions. Cameras zoomed in on Mace's face, capturing every micro-expression. Mace's press secretary tried to regain control, but the narrative had slipped away. Mace's mind raced. That meeting had been private, confidential. Members only. No staff were supposed to be present except for specific cleared individuals. How did AOC know what had been said? Who had told her? Who had betrayed the confidence of that room? She gripped the edges of the podium and attempted to respond, but AOC continued, her voice growing stronger. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her notebook and held it up for the cameras. She claimed it was a sworn statement from a congressional staffer who had been present during that meeting. A staffer who had documented Mace's exact words. A staffer who was willing to go on record. Mace felt the blood drain from her face. If such a statement existed, if someone had actually documented that meeting, if the words she'd spoken in what she believed was a private setting were about to become public, her entire political brand would collapse instantly. She'd positioned herself as a reasonable Republican, someone who could work across the aisle, someone who represented the future of the party rather than its extreme fringe. But in that closed-door meeting, surrounded only by fellow Republicans, she'd used language that was far less measured. She'd said things that would appall moderate voters in her district. She'd expressed views that would align her with the most controversial figures in her party, and now, apparently, someone had written it all down. Mace opened her mouth to respond, to deny, to deflect, but no words came out. The silence stretched for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. The cameras captured everything. Her confusion, her panic, her inability to formulate a coherent response. AOC stood up from her seat. She didn't move toward the podium. She didn't need to. She had the attention of everyone in the room simply by standing. She stated that she would be releasing the full sworn statement to the press within the hour. She stated that she would be calling for an ethics committee investigation into whether Mace had violated House rules regarding respectful conduct. She stated that she would be introducing a resolution condemning discrimination against transgender individuals and requiring sensitivity training for all members of Congress. Then she walked out of the room. The effect was devastating. AOC had entered the press conference, dropped a bomb, and left before Mace could mount any kind of defense. The journalists in the room immediately pivoted from Mace's prepared talking points to demanding responses about AOC's allegations. The questions came rapid fire, overlapping, aggressive. Did she deny making those statements? Would she release her own transcript of the meeting? Would she voluntarily testify before the ethics committee? Did she stand by whatever words she'd used in that private Republican conference? Mace tried to respond, but her carefully prepared answers were useless now. The entire framework of the press conference had been destroyed. She was no longer controlling the narrative. She was reacting, defending, backpedaling. Her press secretary called an end to the press conference after only 8 more minutes, far shorter than the planned 30-minute session. Mace walked off the podium, her legs feeling unsteady, her mind reeling from what had just happened. In the hallway outside the briefing room, her senior staff surrounded her immediately. They were all talking at once, voices overlapping, some angry, some panicked, all demanding to know who could have given AOC that information. Who had been in that meeting? Who had access? Who would have betrayed a confidential Republican conference discussion? But Mace wasn't listening to any of them. She was staring at her phone, watching the clips from the press conference already spreading across social media. The video of her frozen silence was being shared thousands of times per minute. The screenshots of her face captured in that moment of panic were becoming instant memes. And then she saw the notification that made her realize how much worse this was about to get. AOC had posted the promised sworn statement. Not in an hour, as she'd said. Immediately. She'd posted it before she'd even left the Capitol building. Mace opened the document with shaking hands. It was 3 pages long. Detailed. Specific. Damning. According to the statement, signed by a Republican staffer whose name Mace recognized, she had used language in that closed-door meeting that was explicitly transphobic. She had made comments comparing transgender rights to a mental health crisis. She had suggested that accommodating transgender individuals in any capacity was enabling delusion. She had laughed when another member made a crude joke about bathroom predators. None of it was technically illegal. None of it violated House rules in a way that would trigger formal discipline. But all of it was politically toxic. All of it contradicted her public image. And all of it was now public record attached to a sworn statement that would be nearly impossible to refute without calling a Republican staffer a liar under oath. Mace leaned against the hallway wall, her legs finally giving out. She slid down to a sitting position, her designer suit crumpling against the cold marble. Her press secretary was still talking, outlining next steps, discussing damage control, mentioning lawyers and public relations firms and crisis management consultants. But Nancy Mace was barely hearing any of it. She was staring at her phone screen, watching her political career potentially end in real time, wondering how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had managed to outmaneuver her so completely in less than 24 hours. The bathroom tweet had been sent at 6:47 p.m. the previous evening. It was now 10:31 a.m. In less than 16 hours, Mace had gone from controlling the narrative to being completely destroyed by it. And somewhere in the Capitol complex, probably in her office, probably watching the same live feeds and social media reactions that Mace was watching, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was likely allowing herself a small satisfied smile. Because this wasn't just a victory. This was a master class in political combat, and Nancy Mace had just learned that when you start a war with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you better be prepared for her to finish it. 72 hours after the press conference disaster, Nancy Mace sat alone in her office at 11:34 p.m., staring at a manila envelope that had been slipped under her door. No return address, no note, just a single USB drive inside. She plugged it into her laptop, and what she saw made her heart stop. It was a video, recorded 3 months ago. and it showed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, saying something that contradicted everything she'd claimed in the past week. Mace's hand moved toward her phone. This could change everything. But should she use it? And if she did, would it save her career or destroy what little credibility she had left? The past 72 hours had been the worst of Nancy Mace's political career. The sworn statement had dominated 3 consecutive news cycles. Cable news panels had dissected every word of the leaked meeting transcript. Progressive activists had organized protests outside her district office in South Carolina. Conservative allies who'd previously supported her had grown conspicuously silent. Her own party leadership had begun distancing themselves, issuing carefully worded statements about the importance of respectful dialogue while refusing to explicitly defend her. Her polling numbers had collapsed. An internal survey conducted by her campaign showed her approval rating in her district had dropped 17 points in just 2 days. The moderate suburban voters who'd been crucial to her previous victories were abandoning her in droves. Even some of her core Republican supporters were expressing concern about the language in the leaked transcript. Meanwhile, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had become the hero of the moment. Progressive media outlets were running glowing profiles about her strategic brilliance. Political analysts were calling her takedown of Mace a textbook example of how to win a public confrontation in the social media age. Her fundraising had exploded, with millions of dollars pouring into her campaign coffers from energized supporters across the country. Mace had spent those 72 hours largely in hiding, avoiding cameras, declining interview requests, trying to figure out a path forward. Her advisors had offered various strategies. Some recommended a full apology, acknowledging her past statements and committing to do better. Others suggested doubling down, claiming the transcript was taken out of context and attacking AOC for weaponizing private conversations. A few had even quietly suggested that perhaps it was time to consider not running for re-election. None of those options felt right. An apology would alienate her base without winning back moderates. Doubling down would only reinforce the narrative that she was exactly who the leaked transcript suggested. And quitting was unthinkable, an admission of defeat that would haunt her for the rest of her life. So she'd sat in her office, alone, trying to think of something, anything that could shift the dynamic. And then, at 11:34 p.m. on the third night after the press conference, someone had slipped an envelope under her door. Mace had heard the soft sound of paper sliding across the floor. By the time she opened the door, the hallway was empty. The envelope sat there, plain manila, no markings, no return address, no indication of who had delivered it or why. Inside was a single USB drive. Every instinct told her not to plug it into her computer. It could be malware. It could be a trap. It could be another attack disguised as information. But curiosity and desperation overrode caution. She inserted the drive into her laptop and waited as the files loaded. There was only one file. A video, MP4 format, recorded 3 months earlier according to the metadata. Mace clicked play. The video showed a small conference room she didn't recognize. The camera angle suggested it was from a laptop or tablet positioned on a table. The quality was decent but not professional, like someone had set up a device to record a meeting without using an actual video camera. And there, seated at the table, clearly visible and unmistakable, was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She was speaking to a group of about 8 people who appeared to be staff members or activists. The audio was clear enough to understand every word. And what she was saying made Mace's pulse quicken. AOC was discussing political strategy. Specifically, she was discussing how to handle the bathroom issue that had become such a flashpoint in American politics. She was explaining to the group that while she personally supported full inclusion for transgender individuals in all contexts, the political reality was more complicated. She acknowledged that many voters, including many Democrats and independents, had concerns about the implementation of gender-neutral bathroom policies, particularly in certain settings. But that wasn't the damaging part. The damaging part came about 4 minutes into the video when AOC made a comment about needing to be strategic in how they framed the issue. She specifically mentioned Nancy Mace by name, noting that Mace represented a district that could flip in the next election if Republicans were successfully painted as extremists. AOC suggested that if Mace could be provoked into taking a hardline public stance on transgender bathroom access, it would be easier to characterize her as extreme and out of touch, potentially making her vulnerable in her next race. Then came the sentence that made Mace replay the video 3 times to make sure she'd heard it correctly. AOC told the group that they should look for opportunities to bait Mace into making inflammatory statements that could be used against her. She specifically said that Mace's past as a sexual assault survivor might make her particularly defensive about women's spaces, which could be leveraged to get her to say something politically damaging. Mace sat back in her chair, her mind racing. This video showed that AOC had been planning this entire confrontation for months. The swift response to Mace's original tweet hadn't been spontaneous righteous anger. It had been a prepared strategy executed at the optimal moment. The leaked transcript from the Republican conference meeting hadn't been a coincidence, it had been part of a coordinated campaign to destroy Mace's political standing. This video could change everything. If Mace released it, it would expose AOC as calculating and manipulative, someone who deliberately orchestrated a public confrontation for political gain while pretending to be defending vulnerable people. It would show that AOC's moral outrage had been performative, a tactic rather than a genuine emotion. It would undermine every statement AOC had made over the past week and potentially turn her from hero to villain in the span of a single news cycle. Mace's hand moved toward her phone. She could send this video to a reporter right now. Within an hour, it would be everywhere. By morning, the entire narrative would flip. She would go from being the person who'd been destroyed to the person who'd exposed the truth about one of the progressive movement's biggest stars. But something stopped her. She watched the video again, paying closer attention this time to the context. Yes, AOC had discussed strategy. Yes, she'd mentioned Mace by name. Yes, she'd talked about finding opportunities to bait her into damaging statements. But she'd never said anything that contradicted her actual policy positions. She'd never expressed personal hostility toward transgender people. She'd never suggested that her support for their rights was insincere. She'd simply been discussing how to win political battles, something that every politician in Washington did every single day. And more importantly, the video didn't change the fundamental facts. Mace had written that original tweet. Mace had made those statements in the closed-door Republican conference. Mace had built her recent political brand around taking hardline positions on cultural issues. AOC might have anticipated Mace's actions and prepared a response, but she hadn't forced Mace to do anything. Releasing this video would shift the narrative temporarily, but it wouldn't actually clear Mace's name or address the underlying issue. Voters would still remember her original statements. The transcript from the Republican meeting would still exist. And she would have just engaged in exactly the same kind of political opportunism she was accusing AOC of practicing. Mace closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The smart political move would be to release the video. The move that would salvage her career and potentially damage AOC's would be to leak this to a friendly reporter and let the media cycle do its work. But for the first time in 72 hours, Nancy Mace found herself thinking about something other than political survival. She found herself thinking about whether the person she'd become was actually the person she wanted to be. She'd entered politics with idealistic goals. She'd been the first woman to graduate from the Citadel's Corps of Cadets. She'd overcome abuse and assault. She'd built a career on being a different kind of Republican, someone who could appeal to younger voters and suburban moderates. And somewhere along the way, she'd lost sight of those principles in favor of political positioning and social media engagement. The bathroom tweet hadn't been about protecting women. Not really, it had been about generating attention and solidifying her standing with a political base that rewarded inflammatory rhetoric. The leaked transcript from the Republican conference was damaging precisely because it showed her true views that were harsher and less nuanced than the image she projected publicly. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez might have strategized about how to expose that contradiction, but Mace had created the contradiction in the first place. She picked up her phone, but instead of calling a reporter, she opened her contacts and scrolled to a name she hadn't called in weeks. Her district director in South Carolina, someone who'd been with her since her first campaign, someone who'd seen her evolution from idealistic candidate to calculating politician. The call connected after 3 rings. Mace didn't bother with pleasantries. She asked a simple question: if she issued a genuine apology, acknowledged that she'd made mistakes and committed to being better, would anyone believe her, or was her credibility so damaged that nothing she said would matter? The response was brutally honest. At this point, an apology would be seen as political desperation rather than genuine contrition. The damage had been done, but that didn't mean she couldn't change course going forward. It just meant that it would take time, consistency, and a genuine commitment to being the person she'd claimed to be rather than the person she'd actually been. Mace ended the call and sat in silence for several minutes. Then she took the USB drive out of her laptop, snapped it in half, and threw it in the trash. She wasn't going to use the video. She wasn't going to try to destroy AOC in retaliation. She wasn't going to perpetuate the cycle of performative outrage and political warfare that had brought her to this moment. Instead, she opened her laptop and began writing. Not a press statement, not a tweet. A genuine reflection about what she'd learned, where she'd gone wrong, and what she intended to do differently. She wrote about the pressure to perform for partisan audiences, about the temptation to prioritize political survival over principle, about the ways that social media incentivized the worst impulses in politicians and activists alike. She wrote for 2 hours, deleting and rewriting, trying to find words that felt authentic rather than calculated. When she finished, she had a document that was far too long for a tweet, too personal for a press release, and too honest for most political communications. She published it on Medium at 2:47 a.m., with no advance warning to her press team, no coordination with political allies, no strategy for how to frame it or spin it. Within an hour, it had been read by thousands of people. Within 3 hours, portions were being quoted on social media. By morning, political analysts were calling it either the most genuine moment of self-reflection from a politician in years, or the most manipulative attempt at image rehabilitation they'd ever seen. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez read it at 7:15 a.m. while drinking coffee in her apartment in Queens. She read it twice, trying to determine whether it was sincere or strategic. The tone felt genuine, but she'd been in politics long enough to know that sincerity could be performed convincingly when a career was on the line. She thought about responding, either on social media or through a statement. She thought about dismissing it as too little too late. She thought about using it as an opportunity to press her advantage further. Instead, she did something unexpected. She picked up her phone and called Nancy Mace directly. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. No recording, no staff listening in, no public documentation of what was said. When it ended, neither woman issued a statement about it, neither tweeted about it, neither tried to use it for political advantage. But 3 weeks later, when a reporter asked AOC about her feud with Nancy Mace, she gave an answer that surprised everyone. She said that politics had become too focused on destroying opponents rather than solving problems, that social media had created incentives for conflict over collaboration, and that she hoped both parties could find ways to disagree without making every disagreement into existential warfare. When a different reporter asked Nancy Mace about the same topic, her answer was similarly measured. She acknowledged making mistakes in how she'd approached the issue, expressed respect for people with different views, and suggested that maybe the bathroom debate was less important than the many other challenges facing the country. The viral clips never came. The dramatic final confrontation never happened. The political battle that had dominated headlines for days simply faded away, replaced by the next controversy, the next outrage, the next moment of partisan combat that would briefly capture attention before disappearing into the endless cycle. Nancy Mace's polling numbers remained damaged but slowly began to recover as she focused on constituent services and avoided inflammatory rhetoric. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez continued to be one of the most prominent voices in progressive politics, but with a slightly more measured approach to public conflicts. The USB drive remained in Mace's trash can, broken and unused, containing information that could have changed everything but ultimately changed nothing. Because sometimes the most powerful choice isn't the dramatic gesture or the devastating counterattack. Sometimes it's simply the decision to stop fighting and start listening. The Capitol bathroom war had ended not with a bang but with a quiet phone call between two women who discovered that destroying each other was easier than understanding each other. But that ease came at a cost neither really wanted to pay. And in a political environment defined by endless conflict and performative outrage, choosing de-escalation over destruction was perhaps the most radical act of all.